today's video lesson, we're going to distinguish between a regular monopolistic market and what is known as a natural monopoly. Before watching this video, you should watch the two previous lessons in which we have explained how demand and marginal revenue for a monopolist's output are determined, and how a monopolist will determine its profit maximizing level of output compared to its revenue maximizing level and the other areas of economic profit and or loss that a monopolist may experience. So you should recognize on the left here the graph for a regular monopolist facing a downward sloping demand curve with a average total cost curve and a marginal cost curve. The monopolist wishing to maximize profits will follow the profit maximization rule and produce where its marginal revenue equals its marginal cost. And such a firm, as we see here on the left, will then be able to charge a price higher than its average total cost, and therefore earn economic profits. Notice that this monopolist has a fairly normal looking average total cost and marginal cost curve. Marginal cost slopes downwards and then it slopes upwards when the firm begins experiencing diminishing marginal returns. Average total cost slopes downwards and then slopes upwards once marginal cost is greater than average total cost, for all the reasons explained in previous video lessons. In today's activity, however, we're going to look at a special type of monopoly, one in which average total cost diminishes or declines over a much broader range of output than a regular monopoly. We're going to revisit the concept of economies of scale and show the instance in which a monopolist experiences economies of scale over a much wider range of output than the typical firm that we see on our left here. So looking at our graph on the right, we're going to now illustrate the case of a natural monopoly, and then we'll define what a natural monopoly is. So as I have already indicated, if average total cost decreases over a much wider range of output than is typical for a firm, in other words, if the ATC is stretched out and doesn't reach its lowest point until some level of output way beyond where demand intersects ATC, then this may be a natural monopoly. So as we can see, this is really no different than our graph on the left, except I have taken this range of the ATC, the range over which economies of scale are experienced, and I've stretched it out over a much broader or wider range of output. So this firm is experiencing economies of scale, in other words, a decrease in its average total cost resulting from an increase in output over a much wider range of output than the firm on the left. In order for the firm on the right to achieve its minimum average total cost, it must produce a much greater quantity than the firm on the left. So beyond a certain point, the firm's average total cost will start increasing again. And we can infer that there is a marginal cost curve that is also stretched out over a much wider range of output. And because of the mathematical necessity, marginal cost must intersect ATC at its lowest point. So what do we have here on the right? We have an industry in which economies of scale are experienced over a very wide range of output. What does this really mean, and what is an example of such an industry? Let's imagine an industry such as water provision in a city. To provide water to the households and the businesses in a city of, say, 1 million people, a firm must invest in great amounts of infrastructure, including ways to get the water from a freshwater source to the city, and then ways to distribute that water to the different buildings all over that city. If a firm was very small and trying to provide water to only a handful of households, that firm would face very high average total costs. You can imagine if there were, say, 20 firms competing with one another to provide water to a city in which the socially optimal level of output is relatively high. Let's look here. Let's say that the socially optimal level of output of QSO, where marginal cost equals demand, which represents marginal benefit. If this market providing QSO were divided up among, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different firms, each firm providing only a fraction of the total output, each firm providing water would have very high average total costs. Why is this the case? Why is it that if 8 different firms were trying to provide water for a city of 1 million people, each firm would have very high average total costs? The reason is that no individual firm would be able to achieve the economies of scale necessary to bring the average total cost down closer to the price at which marginal benefit equals marginal cost. So in this case, the QF represents the quantity of one firm of 8 in a competitive water market. Notice that if this market was filled with 8 different firms, each firm would have very high average total costs. This is an industry that would actually be better off with only one firm producing water for the entire city. The infrastructure needed has such high fixed costs associated with it that only when a firm produces the entire quantity of water for the industry can ATC approach anything close to the price needed to achieve a socially optimal level of output. So as we can see, if one firm were to provide the water, then that monopolist's average total cost would be much lower than if the market were more competitive. Each firm would have higher average total costs. So generally speaking, to determine whether a particular industry is a natural monopoly, we must look at the demand curve and the average total cost curve. So here's the rule of thumb for a natural monopoly. If demand intersects ATC while it is still downward sloping, then the industry is a natural monopoly. Basically, in such an industry, there is simply not enough demand for the good to necessitate more than one firm producing that good. The industry is actually better off, and society is therefore better off, if only one firm produces the good. But there's a problem. In such a case in which a natural monopoly exists, if the monopolist is allowed to charge a price that corresponds with its profit maximizing, where MC equals MR, its profit maximizing level of output, we'll call that QPM, then the price the firm charges will be much higher than the socially optimal price. So but the monopolist price of PM is much greater than the price that corresponds with the socially optimal level of output. Down here where MC equals MB, this is PSO. Now we are presented with a dilemma. A natural monopoly exists in this market, but if that firm, if that one monopolist is allowed to charge the price that it wishes to charge in order to maximize its profits, it will restrict its output to QPM and charge a price that is much higher than what is socially optimal. What this means is that in such industries as water utilities or others like natural gas utilities or electricity, there will be an underallocation of resources towards these necessary goods, and monopolists will charge a higher price, basically extracting welfare from consumers and transferring it to the monopolist itself. How can society achieve a socially optimal level of output in a natural monopoly? The solution lies in government intervention. As we have explained, a monopolist tends to restrict output and raise its price in order to extract consumer surplus and turn it into profit for the firm. But as we can see here, a natural monopolist isn't likely to earn a great level of economic profit, even if it is profit maximizing, because its average total costs are so high due to the economies of scale that exist in such a market. So we can see that the yellow area represents the firm's economic profit. So even though consumers are paying a much higher price than they would be if we had a socially optimal level of output, the monopolist is not extracting a great amount of profit from society due to the very high average total costs arising from the economies of scale. This is a market that requires government intervention. A combination of price controls and subsidies can help achieve a more socially optimal level of output in the case of a natural monopoly. How could subsidies help achieve something closer to QSO, where marginal benefit equals marginal cost? Well, as we can see, subsidies are actually necessary in order to get a monopolist in such an industry to produce QSO. The reason a subsidy is necessary is that if a government were to impose nothing but price controls, let's assume the government set a price ceiling on water of the socially optimal price. We're going to put a horizontal line right here. Suppose that the government has set a price ceiling at the PSO, the socially optimal price. Now, a price ceiling essentially means that the monopolist can only charge PC, or price ceiling, meaning that the monopolist's marginal revenue now equals PC. The profit maximizing monopolist will increase its output to QSO, since this is the new MC equals MR level of output. However, this firm will clearly be earning economic losses at QSO at a price of PC or PSO, the socially optimal price. This monopolist in the long run would shut down because its economic losses, represented by the blue rectangle, would create a strong incentive for this firm to leave the market in the long run. No profit maximizing monopolist would want to remain in the market providing water or electricity or natural gas in a situation in which it is earning economic losses. So a price control alone at the socially optimal price will not incentivize production in the long run of such goods. What is needed instead is a subsidy, a per unit subsidy, a payment from the government to the monopolist aimed at reducing the monopolist's marginal costs. To illustrate the effect of a subsidy, we're going to draw a new graph here in which we can show how a subsidy might actually help achieve the socially optimal level of output. Here we have an extended version of the graph we drew above. We can now see that the marginal revenue becomes negative at a certain point for this monopolist. In other words, the firm would never voluntarily produce beyond this point right here. This is where the firm's revenue is maximized. We'll call that QRM for the revenue maximizing level of output. But how could a government incentivize a firm to produce at the socially optimal level of QSO? This, of course, is where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. In order to get a monopolist to voluntarily produce out here at QSO, a subsidy is needed. Now, the profit maximization rule says that a firm will always produce where MC equals MR. In order to get a natural monopolist to produce at QSO, the government must therefore impose a subsidy that reduces the marginal cost so that it intersects MR at this point right here. So this is illustrated as a downward shift of marginal cost into the negative range of the price and cost axis. How can a subsidy reduce marginal cost until it is negative? Well, that's basically what we're trying to show here. A negative cost, in effect, is a revenue for the firm. So in order for the firm to produce at QSO, the government will actually be paying for the firm's production of this utility, of this water or electricity or natural gas. So the payment from the government to the producers appears on a graph as revenue for the firm. The monopolist will now have an incentive to produce a socially optimal quantity so that a price control set at PSO, a price ceiling, is now realistically met by the firm. And in fact, a subsidy that lowers marginal cost will also lower ATC. So it's possible that a utility company receiving a subsidy from the government can actually earn economic profits by producing a socially optimal level. So it looks strange on the graph because marginal costs become negative and average total cost becomes negative. But since costs are the opposite of revenues, a negative cost is like a revenue for the firm. This is a case where a monopolist is being paid to produce the utility. So I'm looking out the window of my classroom here in Zurich, Switzerland, and I can see a building called EKZ. This building is owned by the Zurich utility company that provides electricity to my school, to my house, and to everybody who lives in the city of Zurich. EKZ is a public-private cooperation. It is a company that is privately run but publicly subsidized and regulated. Why is a company like EKZ or any monopolist providing utilities to a city regulated by the government? The reason is that without regulation, a natural monopoly will charge a price much higher and produce a quantity much lower than what is socially optimal. Therefore, we commonly call natural monopolies regulated monopolies. Regulation refers to the government's use of price controls and subsidies to encourage a natural monopoly providing a utility to produce something closer to the socially optimal level of electricity, water, natural gas, sewage treatment, garbage collection, and so on. These are industries that generally, due to the large economies of scale, will be natural monopolies, illustrated by a graph in which demand intersects average total cost while it is still downward sloping. Hello everybody. In previous lessons we have gone over extensively how a firm's short-run costs of production are determined by the law of diminishing marginal returns. In today's video lesson we're going to talk about revenues. As you may know, a firm in a market economy, generally speaking, is interested in maximizing its profits. And any firm interested in maximizing profits must take into account both its revenues and its costs. Revenues and costs are how a firm determines whether or not it is earning profits. In fact, total profit is simply a function of total revenues and total costs. So a firm's total revenues minus its total costs tell us the firm's level of economic profit. Now, in our graphs of a firm's short-run cost of production, we generally don't illustrate total revenues and total costs. Rather, what we focus on is per unit costs and per unit revenues. So in our previous lessons, we've shown how a firm's per unit costs, including its marginal costs, its average variable and average total costs, are determined. In this lesson, we're going to focus on revenues. How is a firm's revenues determined in the short run? And we're going to start by looking at a perfectly competitive firm. Let's go over quickly a few of the characteristics of perfect competition. Firstly, a perfectly competitive market is one with many sellers. Many sellers meaning maybe even hundreds or thousands of sellers. There has to be a large number of firms in order for a market to be considered perfectly competitive. Secondly, each of these sellers has identical costs. Each seller is the same. This is a very broad assumption. We're assuming that there is no different levels of costs among the sellers in a perfectly competitive market. In addition to facing identical costs, perfectly competitive firms have homogeneous products. In other words, the output is all the same. Every firm sells an identical product to every other firm. Next, perfectly competitive markets have low entry barriers. This will be very important when we discuss the possibility of perfectly competitive firms earning long-run economic profits. Due to the low barriers to entry, new firms can enter a perfectly competitive market or exit a perfectly competitive market very easily. Next, as we're going to see, perfectly competitive firms are what we call price takers. This means that any individual firm in a perfectly competitive market has little or no control over the price at which they can sell their products. That price is determined in the market for the product, in which thousands of identical firms are selling identical products. Lastly, based on all of these other characteristics identified above, we're going to see that perfectly competitive firms will earn no economic or abnormal profits in the long run. So these are our characteristics of perfect competition. I'm going to move these up here so that we can conduct some analysis based on our assumptions about the perfectly competitive market and the perfectly competitive firm. So let's look at our graph on the left here. Now, you may think that based on these characteristics, perfectly competitive markets and firms are probably just theoretical. I mean, there really is no great or perfect example of an industry in which there are thousands of sellers with identical costs selling identical products. But I can come up with at least one decent example based on these characteristics. Here in Switzerland, we are known for our dairy products. We are known for our cheeses and our chocolate and the delicious milk that we can buy very cheaply at the grocery store. Now, where do milk, cheese, yogurt, and chocolate come from? Ultimately, they come from cows. The market for milk from cows in Switzerland shows many of the characteristics of perfect competition. There are about 15,000 dairy farmers in Switzerland selling tons and tons and tons of milk every day. Now, the price that one farmer can sell its milk for is determined not by that one farmer, rather it is determined by the market as a whole. So if we look at this graph on the left and think of this as the market for raw milk in Switzerland, we'll see that there is a price, an equilibrium price in the market for raw milk that is determined based on the supply, which consists of thousands, we'll say 15,000 farmers. That's approximately how many dairy farmers there are in Switzerland. The total quantity of milk produced in Switzerland in a given day is a function of the supply of milk from those 15,000 farmers and the demand from all of the milk processors that turn that milk into other products. We'll just call that QE. So we can see in our graph on the left that the supply and the demand for milk in Switzerland as a whole determines the equilibrium price of milk in Switzerland. Now, if we look at an individual dairy farmer or one firm in this perfectly competitive market, we can see that the marginal cost represents, in a way, this individual dairy farmer's supply curve. So this represents the individual supply curve of one of the 15,000 dairy farmers in Switzerland. Now we're assuming that the thousands of dairy farmers in Switzerland share a tiny percentage of the total market for raw milk in Switzerland. Therefore, that one dairy farmer, this one dairy farmer, cannot set his own price for milk. If this dairy farmer tried to charge a price that was any higher than the equilibrium price determined in the market, this dairy farmer would not sell any milk because there are 14,999 other dairy farmers selling their milk at the equilibrium price. On the other hand, if one dairy farmer tried to sell his milk at any price lower than the equilibrium price, every single buyer of milk would want to buy milk from that one dairy farmer. So based on what I just explained, based on the fact that any increase in price would lead to an infinite decrease in the quantity demanded, while any decrease in price would lead to nearly an infinite increase in the quantity demanded, that sounds to me like the demand for an individual dairy farmer's milk is perfectly elastic. And in fact, that is the case. The demand for one dairy farmer's milk is going to be perfectly elastic or horizontal at the equilibrium price determined by the market. So here we have an individual dairy farmer's demand curve. So this is the demand for one individual dairy farmer's milk. It is perfectly elastic, meaning that this dairy farmer has no control over the price of his milk. If he raises his price, he will sell 0 liters of milk. If he lowers his price, every single buyer will want to buy if this one farmer lowers his price. Basically, what we're going to see is that an individual dairy farmer cannot raise or lower his price. Therefore, the price is determined by the market, as we see here. This is not only the demand. In fact, this also represents the marginal revenue. MR stands for marginal revenue. One dairy farmer can sell as much milk as he wants at the equilibrium price of PE. If this dairy farmer wanted to sell, let's say this is 1,000 liters, the price he would be able to charge for those 1,000 liters is PE. On the other hand, if he wanted to sell 5,000 liters, he could sell that for a price of PE. In other words, if this dairy farmer increases his output or decreases his output, it has no effect on the market price. He is such a small player in the whole market for raw milk in Switzerland that even if he increases his output 5-fold, there will be no effect on the market price. There are still 14,999 other farmers out there producing milk, so his change in output does not do enough to increase or decrease the market supply of milk to change the actual price of milk. So we've now shown that the demand for an individual perfectly competitive firm's output is perfectly elastic, and it is horizontal at the equilibrium price determined in the market. So this is the price of milk right here at PE. It also represents the firm's marginal revenue, which is, let's define marginal revenue here. This is the change in total revenue attributable to a particular change in quantity. So when the dairy farmer increases his output from 5,000 liters to 5,001 liters, his total revenue will change by the price per liter that is determined by the market. In other words, as marginal revenue is equal to the price determined by the market. We've now got our individual perfectly competitive firm's demand curve. It is just a horizontal line equal to the equilibrium price determined by the market. So the next question is, what is the optimal quantity of milk for an individual dairy farmer to produce based on the marginal revenue determined by the market and the marginal costs determined by the firm's productivity of labor and other variable resources in the short run? We're going to now introduce what is called the profit maximization rule. In order for a firm to maximize its profits in the short run, it should produce at the quantity at which the firm's marginal revenue equals its marginal cost. We're going to explain why this is the optimal profit maximizing level of output in just a moment, but for now let's look at our graph and identify the quantity that this individual firm will wish to produce at to maximize its profits. It's clearly right here at the intersection of MC and MR. At this intersection, the firm will wish to stop producing milk. It will wish to produce milk up to this quantity, which we'll call QPM for the profit maximizing quantity, but not beyond that quantity. Let me explain why this is the profit maximizing quantity of milk for this dairy farmer to produce. Let's say, for example, that the dairy farmer is producing at a point right here on its marginal cost curve. It is only producing, let's see, 4,000 liters. At this quantity, the marginal cost to the dairy farmer is $2. The dairy farmer's marginal cost, the cost of the last liter of milk that the dairy farmer produced, is $2. However, the price at which the dairy farmer is selling its milk per liter is $5. This indicates that on the last liter of milk that this dairy farmer produced, he earned a profit of $3. Now that sounds pretty good. You're earning a $3 profit on the last liter of milk that you produced. But what would happen if this dairy farmer increased his production to 5,000 liters? We would move up along the marginal cost curve, and output would increase to 5,000 liters. Marginal cost would increase to $3. So the last liter of milk that this farmer produced cost him $3, and he was able to sell it for, you guessed it, $5. This farmer is still earning a profit on the margin of $2. So the question is, should he have increased his output from 4,000 to 5,000 liters? Clearly, his total profits increased as his output increased from 4 to 5,000 liters because he still earned a profit of $2 as he increased his output to 5,000 liters. So there was no harm in increasing his output. Therefore, it was a good decision to do so. So now he's going to determine whether or not he should increase his output to 6,000 liters. So let's see what happens to costs and revenues on the margin as output increases again to 6,000 liters. So here we see that at 6,000 liters, the marginal cost rises yet again. Marginal cost increases as quantity increases due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. In fact, marginal cost is now around $4.50 for the last liter of milk produced. Yes, of course, he's still earning a profit. If we zoom in really close here, we can see there's still a profit of 50 cents, even on the 6,000th liter of milk. Now, as we see here, the profits continue to increase for milk production until you get to the point where, and I'll call it QPM again, the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue. For each additional liter of milk up to that point, this dairy farmer's profits increase. But what happens if this dairy farmer produces 7,000 liters of milk? Let's look at a quantity out here at 7,000 beyond QPM. At 7,000 liters, the marginal cost, the cost of the last liter produced, is greater than the revenue earned from the sale of the last liter. In fact, it's around $6.30. This indicates that on the margin, this firm lost $1.30. For that last liter produced, that 7,000th liter, the marginal cost of $6.30 exceeded the marginal revenue of $5 by $1.30. This was a bad decision. This firm should not have produced any more than the profit maximizing quantity of just over 6,000 liters, because every liter of milk produced beyond that QPM, the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue. Therefore, the change in the firm's total profits is negative. Its profits will decrease if the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue. So this brings us back to QPM. At QPM, let's look at that point more closely now. Right here at the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue, this firm is maximizing its total profits. The firm cannot do any better than this. If it produces at a quantity below QPM, it can improve its total profits by increasing its output. However, if it's producing beyond QPM, it can increase its profits by decreasing total output. And that is because beyond QPM, the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue, indicating you're producing too much. Below QPM, the marginal cost is less than the marginal revenue, indicating you're producing too little. So that explains the profit maximization rule, which says that in order to maximize total profits, a firm in a perfectly competitive market, or as we're going to see, any market for that matter, should produce a quantity at which the marginal revenue, in other words, the revenue earned from the sale of the last unit, equals the marginal cost, which is the cost of producing the last unit. In this lesson, we have gone over how demand is determined for a perfectly competitive seller's output. It is determined by the price established in the market for that firm's output. In a market in which there are thousands of identical sellers facing identical costs, an individual firm has no control over the market price. Hence, the firms in perfectly competitive markets are price takers. We have not yet shown the level of economic profit that a firm will earn in the short run and in the long run in a perfectly competitive market. We will show that in a later video. But we have shown that in order to maximize its profits, or as we will see, minimize its losses, a perfectly competitive firm should produce up to the point where its marginal cost equals its marginal revenue. Anything beyond that, the firm can increase its profits by reducing output. Anything below that, a firm can increase its profits by increasing output. In our next lesson, we're going to add the average total cost and average variable cost curves to our perfectly competitive firm diagram to determine the level of economic profit that a firm is earning based on its average revenue and its average total cost, which would give us the per unit profit. And then we'll see what the implications of low entry barriers are to the likelihood of a perfectly competitive firm earning profits in the long run.